All right, well, I'm very excited to have Jenna on because she covers a team that's been terrific, but she also understands what it's like to cover the kind of team that I am covering, because for years, that's what she did. Jenna, first of all, how long have you covered the Bucs?
Since 2007, but actually,
Oof.
if you go back even further, 2006, when I was an intern in college. So I did not cover the team in 2008. I went over to baseball and did some freelancing stuff as well on the side, but then back 2009 and then straight on through to present day, I've covered the Tampa Bay Buccaneers just for different outlets. So it has been quite the roller coaster ride.
Right. And that's what I like. So for people listening, because I know these people listening, they've been through a lot. So I looked it up, from 2011 to 2019, that's 9 seasons, no winning seasons in there, right?
There was one winning season, and okay, so they had a 10.
Or maybe it was one winning season in there.
They had one 9-7 year in 2016, but they didn't make the playoffs. So It's crazy because last year was the first year I covered a Bucs playoff game since their first one, which was in 2007. And that was my first year out of college. I'm dating myself a little bit, but that was my first year out of college. So it was quite the wait.
So what obviously Tom Brady comes in and turns it around. Did you see, first of all, during that stretch, why was it so bad? And because people here, they're convinced that they'll never win under Dan Snyder. They have 2 decades worth of proof to look at. But what was going on during that stretch that you felt like held them back during that time?
There was a lot of change. Malcolm Glazer, who's the patriarch of the Glazer family that owned the Buccaneers, he was the one running things for a long time. And then he slid into poor health. And so there was a transition of ownership where, his children and, there was some, I guess, growing pains, you'd say, with that, like with any sort of transition. And then you try to get the right pieces in place, and things started to fall apart when I'd say Rich McKay left after the Bucs had won their Super Bowl. And then Bruce Allen, who you're very familiar with, had a good working relationship with John Gruden. They tried to keep things together, and they fell apart because they had mortgaged the future to get Gruden. And then they were not hitting on their draft picks after that, and they didn't have draft picks. And so they were trying to build a team with a bunch of free agents, and that was very difficult to do. They couldn't have any sort of continuity with their quarterback position. Tom Brady was really the first quarterback that they had signed to a second contract, unless you count Ryan Griffin. Technically, they brought him back, but he was a backup, so I don't know if that really counts. Right. But Tom Brady's really the first quarterback they had signed to a second contract, which is absolutely insane when you think about it. That just illustrates the lack of continuity they had year after year after year. And they just went through so many coaching changes, so many general manager changes. I know when they had Mark Dominic and Raheem Morris, it was a first-time GM and a first-time head coach, and the head coach didn't even choose his staff. And that just, it didn't work out well. And that was actually something Bruce Arians had said to me today, not related to that, but he felt like it was really important for a coach to always be able to choose his staff. But they made progress in certain areas. They got the first overall draft pick and selected Jameis Winston. They started to hit on a number of guys in the draft. I thought Jason Light was a big hire, but they just couldn't quite get it together. And they had these 7-9 seasons. After a 9-7 year with Dirk Cutter, they decided to make a change there. They brought in Bruce Arians, and it took a little bit of time, but then all of a sudden the magic happened when they brought in Tom Brady. And, truth be told, while Tom was a huge piece, he was the key piece that they brought in, he wouldn't have been able to do it alone. They had a lot of pieces in place that allowed this to happen. And he wouldn't have come to Tampa if there wasn't a strong roster of guys that had been there for a long time, like Levante David, like Mike Evans. Chris Godwin was a blossoming player. Devin White was a guy that was really starting to make his mark in the league, even though he's, coming into his 3rd year. And so there were a lot of pieces that were in place there, but certainly Tom really brought everything together. And the biggest thing I could say about him is that for so long, and Dirk Cutter, this was probably his biggest obstacle as the head coach of this team, was he had said, this team is always finding ways to lose games. Whereas like Tom comes in and it's the 4th quarter of a game, like the wild card game, or actually I should say like the divisional game against the Saints, where it's 20 apiece going into the 4th quarter. And these guys are like, there's no way we're losing this game, even though they had lost to New Orleans twice already that season. They're like, there's no way we're losing this game. Oh, and it was played in New Orleans. We know what a hostile place that is, even though it was during COVID. It's still a difficult place to play. The speed that team has on that turf is just they're very difficult to stop. But they just said, there's no way we're losing that game. They didn't lose that game. So it was the sense of belief that he brought them that really just changed everything. And also, when you're around Brady, and I've never felt this around any other athlete before, granted, I have been around people like Derek Jeter. I have been around some players that were, Hall of Fame type players that cared a lot about what they do, but I've never been around somebody that has cared so much. And you can feel it when you talk to them. And you can tell that teammates feel the same way. He will text them or call them or whatever at 3:00 in the morning, and absolutely they're there and they're responding. And because I know how much it matters to him, and it matters a lot to them too. But when you have a teammate and a leader that it just cares that deeply about success and wants everything to be perfect, you don't want to let that person down.
Right. Well, and that's what I say too. When during that stretch where it was really bad, what was it like for the fan base and for you as a reporter looking at it? Did you ever think there was hope for a turnaround?
Well, because I was here in this city, and I remember the first turnaround with Tony Dungy. I remember he came along. I was in grade school. Again, I'm dating myself here. I'm telling people how old I am, whatever. But I remembered the hopeless feeling before he got here. And then it's like he comes in and they get these new uniforms and they're in a stadium with a pirate ship. And all of a sudden, this team went from being a laughing stock to nothing else matters on Sunday but what's going on with the Buccaneers. And it was a great time for me to fall in love with football. But I saw the way this city just how it galvanized this city. And I remember the heartbreak of the 1999 NFC Championship game with the Burt Emanuel rule, and I remember the heartbreak in Green Bay when they came close to going to the Super Bowl again.
Right.
And then I remember when they finally did it, and you just never thought that was going to happen. So I think always in the back of my mind, I believed it was possible that it could happen again because I had seen it before. They had done the impossible once before. And I didn't feel like they were a bad team per se. I mean, I've seen some bad Buck ball, like in the early, or not the early, but I should say the 2010s, 2011, 2012, kind of that span. That was also coinciding with blackouts, which to me, that was the worst part about that tough time, because you already had fans that were checking out. And then all of a sudden, when you don't have the games on TV, you really start to see this apathy. And that's scary, because it's one thing when you're losing and everybody's just ticked off and everybody's week sucks because the team played horribly, because it's still a town that loves its football. Florida loves its football. But when suddenly people stop caring and they start doing other things on Sunday, then it becomes really, really, really bad.
Right.
So this team had a lot of obstacles they had to overcome. But again, because I saw them do it once before, I think I always had that sense of belief that it was possible to do it again.
Besides Brady, what would you, when you look back, say, what's the first really good move they made that then you look back and say, this was the real start of the turnaround? Because as you said, they had to have a roster that would entice him to go there.
It was Bruce Arians, because Jason Light, the GM, was really on the hot seat. And he had to make a difficult decision to part ways with Dirk Cutter. He had already been part of the regime with Lovie Smith, and GMs don't always get a second chance, let alone a third chance. So Dirk was his decision, and that wasn't an easy move for him, but Dirk was he chose to elevate him. So that was his hire. And then when that doesn't work out for him, getting Bruce Arians, that saved his job. And I think that combination, Bruce and Jason, they don't always see eye to eye on everything, but there's a high level of respect there. And there's times when Jason will say, when Bruce has done this for a long time, he has coached really talented winning football teams. Even though this was his first Super Bowl, he was part of other Super Bowl staffs. He's got this sense of confidence that I think Jason has understood at times. I can defer to Bruce on this and we'll be okay. There's that trust factor. We might not always see things eye to eye, but I'm comfortable deferring to you on this. And with this coaching staff, they've been together for such a long time. I remember watching them during camps, and this is before Brady got there, but just feeling like, this is a really good group of teachers, but also like they really believe in each other. They believe in their system. They believe in what they're doing. And I think when you have that kind of conviction coming to work every day, it changes a lot of things. And I think it really, players can feel that. I was talking to Drew Stanton about that when Arians was first hired. He said his sense of confidence it radiates. through everything. Everybody can feel that. So, and I don't think you get Tom Brady either if you don't have a coach
Right.
like Arians, where, he has worked with some of the best quarterbacks. He has worked with Andrew Luck. He's worked with Carson Palmer. He worked with Peyton Manning. And he also, he's got a unique personality that you don't see with a lot of coaches his age either. He's a coach that, yes, he was schooled in the Bear Bryant way of coaching. And so he is old school in that aspect, but he's also extremely open-minded when it comes to new ways of doing things. For a guy his age to embrace sports science the way he does. Some guys his age might be like, football's gotten too soft. We're going to keep doing things this way. We're going to keep practicing out in the heat. No, like Bruce is, they're wearing GPS monitors and tracking these guys' steps, and they're constantly measuring their hydration levels, which the hydration part, that's nothing new in football. You're always wanting to measure your guys' hydration, but like, oh, this guy took too many steps today, we're going to give him a day off, or we're going to be really proactive. We're going to give Gronk these off days on Friday. We're going to give Sue these off days on Friday because we want to make sure those guys are fresh on Sunday, based on the information he's getting from the sports science department. I think that that's really big. And I think that's also really appealing for a guy like Tom, who, as we have seen, he's also very much into that new age of doing
Yes, things. We've heard.
It's not always about working harder with him, although he does work extremely hard. It's about working really smart with all the pliability and the nutrition. Yeah. He's a big hydration guy too, as you guys all know. Yes. So, I think it's really a combination of that. But I think where it really all began is the fact that, the Glazer family made the decision to keep Jason Light, and Jason goes and gets Bruce Arians, and they had a relationship together from their time in Arizona. And, things really started to turn around for them there. Maybe not instantly, but they did start to turn around.
And then with Brady, when did you feel that? Because I know like the first year it's by COVID, so a lot of it's by Zoom. But when did you feel that presence, and what struck you about it?
It might have actually been in one of the first Zoom calls, which is wild because I did not talk to Tom face to face for the first time until I want to say May of 2021. Like after they won the Super Bowl, that was like the first time I actually stuck out my hand and said, Jenna Laine, it's so nice to meet you in person. And he agreed. He's like, this is so much better than Zooms. And he is so much better than Zooms. But I remember the first Zoom call we had with him, just the look in his eyes, like you just could tell how much it really mattered to him. Not that any of us don't take our jobs seriously, because we do. We don't always take ourselves seriously, but we take our jobs really seriously because we know, like, hey, there's a lot of people out there that could only dream of working in sports. So totally get that. Although I always say I do like the fifth next best thing, because like the players, the coaches, the GMs, like the folks that are running the show, like their jobs, like those jobs require a ton of talent. Me, right. I'm kind of like, the fifth next best thing. You're way higher up than I am. You do a lot of stuff, right? Like you just told me you spent your bye week on Capitol Hill. So you're in a different league than I am. But no, I could just tell how much it mattered to him. And that really, even through a computer screen. And I also had a chance to do a Zoom with him one-on-one as well, shortly after that, or maybe it was a few months after that. But like you could just see it in his eyes, and you could just tell that it really, really mattered to him. And that this was just really important to him. And you kind of got a sense of, okay, this makes sense now as to why this guy, puts himself through this crazy diet, and why he, devotes his entire life to preparing to play football games. It's what this guy loves. You can see why this guy's whole life has been about football for the last 20 plus years.
It's funny too, because for you go from covering a team that was under 500 most of the time to now being on Get Up all the time. So that must have been kind of a crazy year for you, and the transition, or the abrupt change, and you did a great job on TV, so you do. So, but that must have been a kind of an interesting change to go from 0 to 60 almost.
I was on the phone with our editors and our bosses, and they were telling me your life is about to change. And this was while I was in my car, sitting outside the Bucs facility, because this was during COVID when everything was starting to shut down, and we couldn't even go inside the building to use the bathroom. And he hadn't been signed yet, but we knew it was coming. And I just remember our bosses were like, your life is about to change. Yeah. Things are going to be really different for you. You're going to have a lot more eyeballs on you. The pressure is on. And so I definitely felt an increase in expectations there. And I hope that I've been able to live up to them. I know some folks aren't always going to be fans of mine, but I think the biggest thing for me during that time, honestly, this isn't to be like a tearjerker, but the stadium, or I'm sorry, the Bucs facility is right across the street from a hospital. And this was right when things were really getting serious with COVID. And it's one of the bigger hospitals in the area, St. Joseph's Hospital. And you could see just this flurry of activity in front of the hospital. And you almost feel guilty. I know I did, because I'm standing out front of this facility and I'm on the biggest story of the NFL, in this pretty dress and getting to talk about Tom Brady coming to the Buccaneers, and life is so great. And it's like my sister, she doesn't work at that hospital, but she's a nurse. I think I've told you this before.
Yep.
I knew that every day she was going to work scared to death, because they didn't have adequate PPE at the time, and the things that she was seeing, which, if you've got a healthcare worker that was working at an ICU or a hospital at that time, they're all dealing with the residual effects of trauma. It's a real thing. I think because of that, there was no time to be scared. I couldn't doubt myself or anything, because on my way home, like my sister and I would sometimes leave around the same time. She would call me to keep from crying. And it was like, she sometimes she would want to hear about my day. She would want to talk about Tom and is he here yet? What about Giselle? Like, she'd want to know all these things. And she was also really getting more and more into football. That was like her distraction. That was her outlet. And it was like, because of that, I just realized, okay, this is so much bigger than me. Like, I might not think I'm doing a great job, or I might not be, perfect, because you want to be perfect.
Everybody wants to be perfect, and nobody is.
And I just think, though, that it's like, man, I honestly, I think my job's stressful, whatever. I don't get to complain about any of this, because I have no clue what pressure is really like. And so I think that really honestly helped keep perspective. And honestly, the one of the greatest blessings of this past year, aside from the fact that my sister is healthy and she's okay, because we had a lot of scares, was the fact that she got to be one of the healthcare workers in the stadium, in the Super Bowl, in our hometown. She had a better seat than I did in the press box. She was right there, like next to the halftime show. And she primarily focuses on the heart, and she's a nurse practitioner, and she specializes in CV/ICU. She's sending me her, she has one of those watches, and she's sending me her heart rate. And I was like, oh my God, you're going to give yourself a heart attack, because, and that thing was like 154 when Devin White had his interception there in her end zone. She loved Devin White. So, it was so hard for me to concentrate on the game. I'm not going to lie. Like, the game itself was just this crazy blur. I remember the plays, but it was also this blur, because the whole time I'm thinking, thank you, God, for giving her this small semblance of joy. And I felt that way times a million, because, there's, it was, the stadium was filled with 22,000 people, and they're all health, a lot of them are healthcare workers. And I'm thinking to myself, every story that she has, there are countless others just like her that are getting to experience this, and knowing what she dealt with on a personal level. I just, the whole time I just kept thinking about, wow, it's just really cool that they get to experience this. So I know I rambled a little bit.
No, that's great.
It just, I honestly think that it's so important.
It shows that we're a distraction too.
Yeah, I think it's so important that you have family that helps you keep perspective. And honestly, I think you just try to do the best job that you can with everything that you do, and you give it everything you have. But at the end of the day, this job is really important to us, but ultimately, what matters most is the people in our lives that we truly love, and being there for our families. And, she told me I somehow helped her through this crazy time. And I'm just like, all I was doing was just covering the team, but I'm honored to have been able to do that. I'm honored to be able to give her a little bit of a break.
And I think I felt like that too last year, the importance of us serving as a distraction. And even with the podcast, with other things, you knew that for at least that period of time, somebody could focus on something that doesn't have to remind you of all that's going on outside there, and just a little bit of a distraction. That's the best way to say it. But speaking of distractions and quarterbacks, and I want to turn to the game a little bit for a few minutes. And
there's a game, right?
Yeah, there's a game. I will say, I kind of enjoyed that conversation a little bit more than what we're going to talk about the game. I think people will too. But Taylor Heineke, and we were talking before we started recording this, he gave the Bucs the hardest game of any quarterback in the postseason.
Yep.
What do they say about him now?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking to Bruce Arians today, and this was the first day we had a chance to really talk to everybody, him and the players coming off the bye week. We had Arians. Well, we had a couple guys and Arians on Monday, but today was the first like kind of normal day getting ready for game week, and that actually came up. The Bucs they faced a number of future Hall of Famers between Drew Brees and Aaron Rodgers. And Patrick Mahomes during the playoffs, with the guy that gave him the most trouble was Taylor Heineke. And why was that? And Bruce Arians had said that, part of it was the element of surprise, because up until kickoff, they thought that they were preparing for Alex Smith. They were really, really surprised by that. But at the same time, he said that guy is quick. And they have faced mobile quarterbacks before, but he goes, that guy is so quick and he's really accurate. And a lot of times the guys that have the legs, sometimes maybe they're not always as accurate downfield. Maybe I know that they didn't see the very best of Justin Fields this year. They didn't see the best of Jalen Hurts. Taylor Heineke is definitely a step up from those guys based on what they saw this past year. So it was a huge victory for them. It was also a huge victory for their offensive line to be able to handle that type of pass rush this past year, because it was one of the best defenses that they were going to face. And at that time, their offensive line had some injuries and they were just really starting to gel together. And that's one of their biggest strengths right now, I would say, is their pass protection. So that game was really, really big for them to do that. And it was also on the road, and been so long since they had been in the postseason, they didn't really know what to expect. So, and if you remember that game, like you really did not know which way it was going to go late in the game like that.
They hung around.
And
they hung around and they got to a point where it's like, oh, they actually have a chance if they just do this. But when you're facing Brady, you have to have a big lead at the end there most of the time, or you have to make a play at the end. But with this team, like, how are they different, better? And I know, like, you just wrote about some of the problems they've had, some of the penalties and things like that. But how are they different this year or better?
This offense is so different, and they're missing a lot of pieces. They started off the year red hot with Rob Gronkowski. In the first 2 games of the year, he led the NFL with 4 touchdowns, which is just not normal for a tight end. This guy was unstoppable. And if you remember the way he finished out the year last year, he had 2 touchdowns in the Super Bowl. Like, he was on fire. So it was 3 consecutive games going back to last season where he had 2 touchdowns, 2 tutties, as he calls them. And unfortunately, in week 3, he suffers cracked rib injury. He also, and I don't know medically how this is even possible for someone to have a slight pinch in their lungs. And I talked to some medical professionals that are in my family about it, but nonetheless, he had some pinched lung, a slightly punctured lung, I should say. And he somehow played through it, which beyond my comprehension, but he's been out. And then they finally thought they got him back. And he plays 5 snaps against the Saints because he starts having back spasms, which are actually connected to the ribs. So I've learned. And he's of course had three back surgeries that we know about, with herniated discs and fractures. So this guy has a history of back issues. So, but prior to all that, like, this offense was a well-oiled machine. The way they started the year out, Antonio Brown was hot. He's now injured too. He's had an ankle/foot injury that's kept him out for a few weeks. He also was out at one point because of COVID early in the season. But, this offense, it just looked like Brady looked comfortable. I mean, last year he was talking about the fact that even midway through this season, he was calling out plays and it was like a different language.
Right.
I didn't necessarily realize his level of kind of discomfort in the offense until he talked about it a little later. Because to me, he still looked like he was doing fine, but they also were able, and I give Byron Leftwich a lot of credit, and he's a DC guy. So I give him a ton of credit because he was able to take Bruce Arians' offense, and he was able to take what Tom Brady did in New England. And by the season's end, they were able to really mesh those things together. Because remember, you bring Tom in, you can't do, especially with a pandemic, and you're not having an off season, you can't tailor everything to what he does, because you've got all these other guys. You've got 10 other guys on offense, like, that are starting, and you have to do things that they're used to. And so in the beginning, he was playing Bruce Arians' offense. Now they're doing a ton of things that Brady really liked to do in New England. And there's a ton more pre-snap motion and even motion at the snap. And there's a lot of play action. And there's so much more balance this year. They're running the ball. Like, we really didn't see their commitment to running the ball until the emergence of playoff Leonard Fournette during the postseason. And that really, I think, just kind of, we saw it really in that Saints game, in the NFC divisional game, where it was like, okay, you really started to see that identity take hold. And so that's continued, and that's honestly helped them a lot without AB and without Gronk. It's made it easier for other guys to kind of step in. And now the latest injury, since I'm talking about him, is Chris Godwin. He missed practice today because he's got a foot injury. And we're like, when did this happen? Because it didn't happen, and we didn't see it happen in the Saints game. And the fact that he missed practice is pretty significant. Arians doesn't know what his status is going to be yet for Sunday. But, and he had a lot of injuries last year, but he's been like a rock for Brady this year.
He's been really good this year.
He's in that slot, but he's not like a typical slot receiver. He's a big slot, very sure-handed. He's been super consistent. I know he was dealing with some ball security issues around the time that you saw him last year, but he's been so consistent. So you're like, what? So that's really going to be interesting because they're losing a lot of guys on offense.
That is a lot.
The injuries were defensively. They were kind of okay on offense for a little while early on, and now it's catching up to them. And
that's the last thing I want to ask about the defensive injuries. Who do you expect back this week? Where are they still banged up, and who would you expect back and the impact?
Yeah, well, the biggest injuries that they've had have been in their secondary. Like they've been without their starting cornerbacks for a while now. Sean Murphy-Bunting since week 1, Carlton Davis since week 5. Davis isn't back yet. Murphy-Bunting just came off of IR. It's too soon to tell whether or not he's going to play, just because obviously that's a position where you're sprinting a lot. He has not played in some time. He's coming off a dislocated elbow. He showed me, he's got some good range of motion, and I'm part of the dislocated elbow club. So I can certainly appreciate that, because it took me a lot longer than just a few weeks to straighten my arm again. He didn't have to have surgery, so he was lucky, but he's playing with the sleeve, and I don't know if they're necessarily in a rush to get him back per se, because they want him to be back and healthy. But Richard Sherman, who had a hamstring injury and was active against the Saints but didn't play, Arian said he's good to go. So I think he's a guy that you probably could expect to be out there. So I would probably guess your starters would be Jamel Dean and Richard Sherman. But even Dean has been playing on like a banged up knee, and I don't think he's been 100% this year. So, and then you probably have Ross Cockrell still in the slot. But at some point you will see Murphy-Bunting go in there. I don't know if it'll be this week. It might be next week. He's got 3 weeks essentially, because they activated him, the 21-day practice window last week. He could go at any point. It wouldn't shock me if they rested him one more week, but we'll just have to see how things go. But, those guys certainly, it's difficult when you're constantly, like I was looking at a lot of their penalties. Penalties have been a big issue for them. And it's like, well, they've had so many different guys. It's not like it's one guy.
Right.
They had so many different guys in the back end, and they're getting a lot of defensive pass interference calls. And I feel like if you've got guys that are back there and they're comfortable, they'll trust their technique more, and they're not going to be making some of those mistakes per se, or they're not having to make some of these moves where, yes, it's gonna, ultimately cost them a penalty, but it's like, okay, you saved a touchdown there. You'd be able to trust each other and trust the coaching a little more. But also keep an eye out for Jason Pierre-Paul too, because he posted over the bye week a couple tweets that really just kind of blew my mind, because he said he's been playing with a torn rotator cuff, and he's also got like a finger that's like broken in two.
Ooh.
And he said that this rotator cuff, he said, I've had some injuries before, but this rotator cuff is like the most painful thing I've ever dealt with in my life. And I'm like, you literally had a fireworks accident where you had to have your finger amputated. You suffered burns on your hand. You lost portions of your other fingers. Oh, and you were in a car accident where you fractured 2 vertebrae in your neck. And you're telling me that this is the most painful thing you've ever dealt with? Like, I mean, and I think he missed 2 games. He missed 2 games this season. The fact that he's playing through this and he's playing with that kind of pain.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. I don't know if towards the stretch, because they do have a rookie that they drafted, Joe Tryon Shoyinka, who has performed really well. And he's not quite the run defender that JPP is, but JPP said, man, I wish I had that guy's stuff when I was a rookie. Like, that's how highly he thinks of him.
Wow.
It's great that they have him this year to be able to rotate him in so that JPP doesn't have to kind of carry that burden all by himself, because for him to talk about pain like that, and he is not a weak guy. I don't think anybody thinks that he's soft. He's like the last person on the planet to consider soft.
Nobody would say
so that. For him to say that is pretty significant. So I'm very curious as to how that's going to affect him down the stretch.
Jenna, awesome stuff. And this is why I like talking to you, because your insight is always really good. And for people listening, she wrote a story on, is it John Spytek? Is that how?
Yes, yes.
The Bucs executive who ran the New York City Marathon in honor of his late daughter. I think she had died the year before, but a really good story. It was on there a couple weeks ago, I think it was, but go check it out because it's worth reading. So Jenna, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was Evelyn Spytek was her name, and she died of CMV. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that.
Okay.
He was running in honor of her and other babies affected by CMV. So if you're not familiar with it, definitely check it out because it's one of these respiratory,
right,
one of these viruses that's like a common cold, but for pregnant women, it can be absolutely devastating. And one of the cool things I learned in doing that story is that, and by the way, they're still tallying how much money he's raised, but I know he was telling me, like, when we put the story out, I think it was like $25,000 he had raised, which is a lot. Maybe not if you hang out with people like Bruce Arians and Tom Brady, maybe it's not a lot, but for all of us, it's a lot.
Yeah.
But the last I checked with him, he's like, yeah, we might get to like 55, 60,000. Like,
wow, good.
And this is huge because, this is something not a lot of people talk about, but it's affecting babies. And a lot of times babies won't even show symptoms, but 2 years down the road, all of a sudden a child can wake up and they can't suddenly hear anymore. So if they detect that a pregnant mother has this, they can give her antivirals and they can also give the baby antivirals. So they're fighting to make this part of routine infant screening. And, they're just trying to raise awareness for it. But it was really beautiful because he took up running to help cope with the fact that his daughter was so sick and then she died. And he had just said that running a marathon is a great metaphor for life. So I think anybody that has ever dealt with grief or has kind of understood what that does to you can really appreciate his journey and he also lost his job 2 months after his little girl died. He was with the Cleveland Browns at the time. So I think anybody that's ever dealt with grief and hardship can really appreciate the journey he's been on. It was cool the fact that he got to do it during the bye week.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Jen. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, John. See you soon.
Yeah.